In today's journey, we're making a Black Moscato. That is a Moscato wine kit from WinExpert that we will be adding 8 ounces of blackberries to per gallon. We're going to jump right in and start by verifying everything's here. First, we have our reserve pack that will be saved for later. Second pouch contains the majority of the sugars that will be eaten during fermentation. Do not mix these up. Everything else that comes with your kit should be packaged inside of a cellophane pouch. It is alright if the contents do not match identically, but if you feel that something is in error, contact WinExpert directly and have your lot number printed on the box ready. Up first, we have the chiasen, one of the fining agents, the instructions, which will be important to keep throughout the process, the yeast, a chiasol, which will also be used in the clarification process, a package of sorbates and sulfites used for stabilizing the wine later, and finally a package of bentonite, which will be used for clarification towards the beginning. Once you verify that you have everything and that nothing is damaged, we're going to put everything away besides the wine base, bentonite, and yeast. What you will need to bring to the table is a fermentation vessel that can hold at least a gallon, your sanitizers, and about a gallon of water, including a cup of hot water. You will also want to make sure that all of your kit ingredients are at room temperature. If it's too cold when you add the yeast will go into shock, either leading to a slow fermentation or a false start. The first step is to take a cup of hot water and mix in the bentonite to it. Bentonite is clay, so it can be a little tricky. Just take your time with it. These instructions are a lot easier than the old ones where they would have you try to mix it with less water. And no, you will not be drinking clay, as what's going to happen is, during the clarification process, it's going to fall out of solution, being left behind in some of the lees. The fancy word for crap left behind in the fermenter. We really like this tiny whisk for this job, but we mostly got it just in honor of the person who inspired our headless style videos, Cooking with Babish. Now, it's going to look a little awful even once you get most of it mixed together. There'll be little clumps on the whisk, but don't worry, just get it as mixed together as you can. It's going to get mixed up a lot more once we add more water. Clay is in fact water soluble. This is technically an optional step if you don't care about the clarity of your wine, but remember, we do eat with our eyes first. Now, you may be fancy like Phil and not need your instructions, but what you do need to do is remember to thoroughly mix the wine base before adding it to the fermenter. This helps make sure that everything is thoroughly mixed and you don't leave any important parts behind in the bag. When it comes to opening the bag, what you'll want to do is make sure the liquid is below the neckline, choke it, and then pry the cap off. It can be a little tricky, and sometimes a little pry bar like the scissors works wonders there. Some people even just cut the bag with scissors. Other people often wonder why they're not getting quite the amount of alcohol or the gravity points out of the reserve as they should. And that has something to do with the fact that they're not rinsing the bag out with a little bit of water. There's so much sugar in this concentrate that some of it's going to get stuck to the side of the walls. Look how much color is in that water that I just poured into the bag already. So we're going to slosh it around, make sure we get any sugars that may have dried to the walls or anything that was left behind so that we can add it in with everything else. That is alcohol abuse to leave that behind. However, this is not as important for this recipe as we will be adding blackberries, which will also up the alcohol value. So do what you feel is right. Now, you may have noticed that no one ever actually tells you the exact amount of water to add. That's because you need to mark the vessel yourself, because the amount of water in the wine base can vary from batch to batch. And this can be for a number of reasons, but the biggest one is that wine is an agricultural product, meaning that it has a varietal difference from year to year. Now, at this point, you may notice little flakes or floaties inside of your wine, or must, as it would be called at this point, and that's okay. That's some of the bentonite that's not completely dissolved yet. As this sits and gets mixed around in the next couple of steps, those should start to go away. If they don't, it's no big deal. They'll settle to the bottom, and they will be left behind during the first transfer. Now, what would happen if I added the rest of this water? Well, it would come in with less alcohol percentage per volume, and it might not clarify properly according to WinExpert, which may or may not matter to you. But what matters to us right now is that we need to mix this up as thoroughly as possible. Not only will this help make sure that our ingredients are thoroughly mixed, but also that we want aeration at this point. Yeast needs oxygen. And right now there's no alcohol in solution, so we want to get as much oxygen in there as possible right now. Although don't worry too much, as we're not doing this professionally. Alright, one of the last steps of the first day is doing a gravity reading. We'll be using a refractometer to help conserve on any loss during the process. And yes, a hydrometer would be more accurate, but again, unless you got a job at a winery in the last 10 minutes, I wouldn't worry about it. Ours came in a little low, but yours should be somewhere between 1065 and 1075. If it's not, as long as it's close, you'll be fine. If it's way off, some adjustments may need to be made, and if you have any questions about that, just let us know down in the comment section. Alright, now the penultimate thing we need to do today. Put the yeast in. Just cut it open with some sanitized scissors and then just pour it right in. You don't need to worry about mixing it in all the way, just let it sit on top and that's plenty. The only thing you want to make sure of is that you get all of the yeast in. If you end up only putting half the package in, not only will it take a lot longer to ferment, it might not make it all the way to the intended final gravity. Once you are confident you got all your yeast in, it is time to move on towards the end, and that is either putting a loose lid or airlock on top of your fermenter. You don't need an airlock, but we prefer to use them. Finally, clean up. This must might need to be here at 75 degrees Fahrenheit for the next 2 weeks, but the mess doesn't need to be. So clean that up, wait 2 weeks, and we'll come back. Now, you could have added the blackberries at the last phase, but we decided to add them later because we decided to modify the recipe later. So we're doing it now. It's not a terrible idea to make sure that your base wine has turned out properly before adding any additional material. It just makes sure everything's going fine, and it wasn't your modification that went bad, but the wine itself. Now, you do have a couple of choices here yourself. You could do the stabilization process now and end up with a much sweeter wine with a very big blackberry flavor. We want a more delicate flavor, so we're going to ferment a little bit on the blackberries first and then do the stabilization after the next transfer. This will add to the alcohol content, but we're okay with that. You could neutralize that by adding a little water if you wanted to, but that's what's great about these 1 gallon kits is that you can make them your own without much worry of losing $120 if you don't like the outcome. For the blackberries, we are using 8 ounces of pre-frozen blackberries. These can come directly from the grocery store frozen, or you can buy them from your local farmer's market and freeze them yourself. We recommend freezing and washing anything that comes from the garden just to make sure there's no other bugs or bacteria from the outside world on. We don't mind the yeast inside the skins. We do want to make sure we don't infect the wine. We also want to make sure we don't shock the yeast and stall out the fermentation, so that's why the blackberries also need to come to room temperature. You could also alternatively add whatever fruit you want to at this point. It doesn't have to be blackberries, but the main thing is that we want the yeast to ferment it, so it needs to be at room temperature. And Phil is really getting involved in making sure every last drop of that blackberry gets in there. Now, most winemakers will be using gravity to do their transfers, but we've been trying out this anti-gravity pump for long-term review, and we like it so far. We have been a little worried about the aeration quality of it, but it's tricky to find out right now because what will also be happening at this moment is degassing. Even if you were using your mini auto siphon like actually recommended at this point, you should see some foam up like this, and that is CO2 leaving solution, and that's a good thing in wine for the most part. In fact, that's what basically the entire degassing process is knocking CO2 out of solution and allowing it to foam up. And wow, look at that color. In fact, that's what's inspired this entire process, was that there's not a lot of 1 gallon rosé or other non-basic wines that are available in that size. I think that not having some of the LEs in 1 gallon kits is a huge missed opportunity to really advertise how good those high-end kits can be. And they are worth the money, but I understand the stress that comes along with that for especially a first-time winemaker. But the Diablo Rojo, oh wow, that one is amazing. But I'm getting distracted. The 2 regrets that we have during this process is that Phil didn't use the speed regulator on the pump, so it's only operating at full speed. And you can see it's kind of jetting things around. And also, We wish we had broken up the blackberries a little bit. We didn't want to make it into a puree, but I feel like we should have at least crushed them a little bit. But we don't want them to be completely apart because we're going to use their color as an identification process for when we're done. And Phil would say at this point that this is why he did it this way. That we wanted the blackberries to ferment as a secondary fermentation. That way we will be able to control that part by itself without having to wait for the main Moscato part to finish its fermentation. If the Moscato finished first with the blackberries in, it's not a big deal. We just wait for the blackberries to lose their color and look like little vampires. But if the vampires come first, then we have the problem where we still have to do this secondary transfer regardless. If the fruit is left in too long, you can start extracting flavors that we don't want, excessive tannins, or even start to grow mold if too much is exposed to oxygen while it's floating around. However, there shouldn't be a lot of oxygen in your fermenter as it should be mostly replaced with CO2 by now. However, unlikely, improbable, and other words do not necessarily mean impossible. So not something to freak out about, but something to be mindful of. So this part is a little more time dependent on what the fruit wants to do itself. So just leave it where it was fermenting at so far, put the airlock in, and let it sit until it tells you when it's done. And forewarned, it's going to be a little bit of, I'm going to drink that. Because the first sign that your fruit's done is that it loses most of its color and it looks kind of gross. It has something to do with the fact that fruit just looks weird when it gets bloated. Another indicator when your blackberries or other fruits are done is notice how they're sitting at the bottom right now. When these guys have given their all, they will start to float to the top, and it will actually start to look something like this. And here we are, about 2 weeks later, and you can see that the blackberries are definitely less black and much bigger. I would not want to eat one of those, as it would taste mostly not like a blackberry at this point, but more like blackberry Moscato. Actually, they'd probably just taste awful. But at this point, what we really need to do is a gravity reading. Again, we'll be using our refractometer. A hydrometer would be better. Looks like Phil's going into secret to find out what it is, and the secret is it's a 1010. And that's kind of really high, especially since we haven't even added the reserve bag yet, and that's going to raise the gravity even higher. And that's actually perfect for us because we were going for obnoxiously sweet. It's a little bit of rebellion against all those ultra dries that are everywhere. However, if that's not what you're after, you could always finish off fermentation, and if you need to, pitch a little extra yeast. EC 1118 is what you would be after if you needed extra. If you need help finding any, check the links in the description, which may or may not be affiliate links. If you were looking to follow the recipe a little more exactly, you're looking for under 10, so like a 993. But like I said, we don't, so we're going to actually move to the next transfer phase. You will probably want to use a mini auto siphon, but we will again be using our anti-gravity pump, this time using one of the black fine filters. There does seem to be a few things Phil seems to be doing wrong, and that is he's shoving the outlet too closely to the sidewall, making it fill up with a little back pressure. The other issue is we really should have used a less fine filter. Maybe go to the blue. We really just wanted to make sure we didn't get any of the blackberry crud up in our pump. Because for those that don't know, the anti-gravity pump is not friendly for taking apart to clean, so we would like to avoid doing that as much as possible. But the negative effect is that we're getting a lot of aggressive degassing in the pump, and it's hard to distinguish that between just normal aeration. Something that we are really liking is the fact that the anti-gravity pump is able to get nearly every last drop out, even while dealing with all this excess fruit. If you're doing this with an auto siphon, it may be beneficial to wrap the auto siphon in a muslin bag or a nylon bag that's food safe. That'll help prevent any of the fruit from clogging up the siphon, blocking your siphon from being able to transfer. Otherwise, you may lose suction and have to restart your auto siphon mid-transfer, and that's never fun, especially when you're really close to the end. Now, something that's kind of probably really iffy about what Phil's doing right now is he's blasting out the last bit of wine that's stuck in the line by letting some air in the other end. Could this cause oxidation? Maybe, probably. But we're really trying to get every last drop out of this wine and seeing worst case scenario usage for the anti-gravity pump. Because if we aren't anything, it's quasi-scientific with a high level of ethics, at least according to us. But back to the wine. When you're done fermenting and you're happy with the sweetness, it's time to do the stabilization. Now, big wine misconception, stabilizing wine doesn't actually kill active yeast. Don't worry, we won't go too much into the science of it, but the important thing is that there's another chemical in here that's going to help absorb loose oxygen. And that's really cool for what we're about to do during the degassing process if you do it the way the instructions tell you to. That doesn't make it immune to oxidation, it just means right now it's not number one concern. Right now, we're more worried about the CO2 that's still in solution. And there are a few ways to deal with that. The most common in the professional world is vacuum. The other way that a lot of homebrewers like to do it is by whipping, either with a power tool adapter or by hand. We don't recommend by hand. WinExpert recommends to do this. Shake gently until a little bit of pressure starts to form. Not too much, as it could break the glass container. What you'll want to do then is burp it, let it out. You could have actually noticed a little bit of cloud that formed inside of the jar there. And you'll want to repeat that until when you open the jar, there's no poof. We're not really interested in doing it this way though, because like some people, we don't like the idea of just sloshing our wine around until it's fully degassed. There has to be a better and more scientific method to solve this problem of saturated CO2. Our preferred method in the past has been by vacuum, but we've usually just hooked up our wine into the inlet of our air compressor, which isn't really safe because there's no way to control the amount of vacuum applied. And that's actually important. Plus, sometimes when I use my nail gun, I can smell wine, and that's probably not good. In today's experiment, we're going to be trying a brake bleeder kit. And, it does say not to let any moisture in there, and I have a feeling that's going to be a problem. But what's great about it is we're able to control the amount of vacuum applied to the wine. The target that we're looking for is about 25 inches of mercury. There's an indicator that you're starting to get close, and that is that a cloud of CO2 will start to form inside of the container. Don't get too excited, as that's just the start. The bigger indicators that you're looking for is that the liquid should start to look like it's boiling, because it kind of is, but just more of a CO2 situation. Now, using a vacuum pump isn't going to save you a ton of time, but it is a lot gentler on the wine. Now, Phil at least was nice enough to get us a few close-up shots with his phone, but what we're looking for is about a 1/16 of an inch on the bubble size. Anything bigger and you're actually starting to pull other gases and maybe even some ethanol out of solution. A good way to help avoid accidentally vacuum distilling would be to lower the temperature of the wine down to 64 degrees Fahrenheit before starting vacuum degassing. Because if putting water in a pressure cooker raises the temperature of a boil in that, then being in a vacuum lowers something's boiling temperature, such as at 25 inches of mercury, ethanol's boiling point is 76 degrees Fahrenheit, if I recall correctly. Regardless of its exact boiling temperature at this vacuum, it is a temperature that is completely achievable at a standard room temperature, depending whose room you're in. If you were to accidentally boil off some, that would be fine, because we'd be talking in parts per million anyways. So don't worry about it too much, but keep it in mind. One of those it depends situations. Well, on a regardless, what we'll want to do is have this sit at 25 inches of mercury for about 30 to 60 minutes. Now, this round probably doesn't need that much time because we got plenty of degassing from the mechanical pump we used. But it doesn't hurt to make sure, because as you can see, there's a lot of gas in there. Alright, here we are, about 3 hours later. Kind of forgot watching a movie. But what we have here now is something that's nearly done. But wouldn't you know it, what we were expecting to happen has happened. Moisture got up inside of the pump, and that's really bad for the O-rings that they use inside of these things. Later when we disassembled it, it is a goopy mess in there. The O-ring is destroyed. So we are actually not able to get back to 25 inches of mercury at this point. We are at about 10. We're able to get up a little bit, but it starts to fall out almost immediately. This pump is destroyed. What we would have done in the future is use a desiccant in line to help avoid any moisture that would have come up into the hose line. So that answers that question about whether or not a brake line bleeder can be used for degassing a wine. The answer is kind of, but you gotta do something about the moisture. So we'll revisit it in the future. You'll want to make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss that video. It's gonna be a gas. In our personal adventure, we let this sit at the lower pressure for a little while, about an hour or two, but we're going to move on to the clarification stage now, as you should too. At this point, what you'll want to do is reopen the vessel and get your Kiasol packet ready. However, if you have a shellfish allergy, you may want to skip the clarification phase and just use cold in time or biofine. Regardless of what clarification agent you use, you will want to add it at this time and stir it in. And just as a side note, that if your kit came with 2 packages of Kiasol, you'll want to add only 1 at this time, as the other one will be used later on. Why we have to stage out all these clarification additions, I don't know. But what I do know is that we're going to stir this at least 3 more times before we're done. So at some times it's going to feel like you're moving backwards during the clarification process. Don't worry, in the end, everything will come out just fine. But we only need to mix it once today, and that makes the end of day 14. All we need to do now is close up the lid and wait 24 hours before we go to the next phase. So here we are 24 hours later, and what we're going to do first is add the reserve pack. The reserve pack is the additional sugars that we didn't want the yeast to eat, so it's going to be the sweetness. So if you've already augmented your kit enough that you don't need to add any more sweetness or body, you could skip the reserve and use it for something else, but we're going full force here today. And pro tip, unless you're trying to show off like Phil, you could just use those scissors to cut open a corner of the bag, and it makes it a lot easier. Now, you may think these bags are very similar to the one that we poured in the beginning, but they're actually very different. This bag contains a lot more of the grape essence and flavor to it than the first bag, which was mostly just sugar. This bag, we unfortunately can't use a cup of hot water to rinse out, because what that would do is dilute the wine that's already in the fermenter. So unfortunately, get out what you can and leave the rest behind. And then stir it in, as per the instructions. In fact, I may only have an applied science degree, but I don't know why we couldn't just pour everything in together right now, instead of doing it separate. Because the next step is to get the chitosan out, and we're going to open that... Way to go, Phil. We're going to open that container, and then we're going to pour it in and mix it in. And there's a perfect example of why it's a good idea to spray down your entire work area with Star San before you start working, and then you don't have to worry about things like your tools falling over. It's a sanitized surface. Though if you feel nervous, of course, you can always spray it down. Phil's always been a little overly protective and detailed about some things, but not about others. Don't give me that look. Look, no one can hear what you're saying anyways, so just get this going. This video is already like 25 minutes long. Now, this is going to be the last time that we actually stir this up, so you're going to want to make sure that you get in there pretty good and make sure that it's thoroughly mixed. If you only partially mix it, you may end up with cloudy wine at the end. Now it's time to put this away for about 14 days to see the fruits of our labor. You'll want it to be about 70 degrees Fahrenheit and away from any direct light. And here we are 14 days later, and you can see that anything that was making the wine opaque before is now completely gone. I'm sorry, that's not properly pedantic enough. It's not completely gone because it's just settled out to the bottom of the fermenter. Though it's not really a fermenter right now. Though it was used to ferment before, but we didn't do fermenting this time. It was just clarification. So was it a clarification vessel or a quadrary fermentation chamber? It probably doesn't really matter. At this point, what we're going to do is another transfer, and this is considered polishing. We just want to make sure that anything that's still around at the bottom or can get re-roused really easy, we want to get rid of it before we move on to bottling to make sure it doesn't end up in any of the bottles. A normal person at this point would probably, again, just use a mini auto siphon, but again, we don't want to have any loss. So we're using the anti-gravity pump again, and this time we're a little less happier about the way it's working, as there's no degassing happening now. It's completely degassed. So what we're seeing is probably aeration. And that is probably directly related to the fact that Phil refuses to preload the line with sanitizer like you're supposed to. We'll do a little more experimenting in the future and see how it turns out. Something that we're not going to experiment with is letting this sit for 2 days before we do the bottling. This will give a chance for any of the particles that were accidentally transferred over during that last transfer. And here we are on the bestest of best days ever, wine bottling day. Although bestest best may be over-exaggerating. But it's still a pretty great day. And what you'll want to start the day by doing is either transferring this gallon of wine into a bottling bucket. We recommend making a custom one out of a 2-gallon bucket. We will of course be using our anti-gravity pump again just because we feel like showing off. But to make this work, we will be using a stainless steel bottling wand and not a plastic one, which could be dangerous in this situation if not done properly. In fact, if you were to do this yourself, you do so at your own risk. We built a custom box to turn down the pressure on the pump, where that doesn't come standard. Also, of course, you should be using a pump with a foot pedal just in case something does go wrong and to limit the amount of pressure on the line. And to the person saying, but wait, doesn't this cause aeration? Well, we're still testing that out. At the lower pressure, it should be less, and it should only actually cause a problem for the first bottle. Once the hose line is saturated, it shouldn't be an issue. But, the stuff they use in the industrial side of filling wine is probably no worse or better. However, they probably do pre-fill the bottles with either nitrogen or CO2 to preserve freshness and avoid any aeration. But here's the secret. Corks let in oxygen. That's why they add sulfites to wine, is to eat the oxygen. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. We will let the taste testers be the deciding factor. But alright, we did the last one at normal speed, which took about 30 seconds from start to finish to fill the bottle. What we're going to do now is speed up so we can move on to the corking. On average, I've usually gotten just under 5 bottles for doing most 1-gallon batches of wine, but your results may vary. You should always have at least 1 extra bottle ready to go. One may go bad, you may have more than you think, or you may have just enough to do a partial fill of a bottle in. You don't want to let that go to waste. And speaking of waste, what's amazing about this pump is that we can get basically every last drop out when we're not avoiding sediment or other things. But a fault to everything. If you try to get every last drop, you're just going to end up blowing bubbles in the last bottle. And how well did we end up doing in the end? Well, we got 4 full bottles, and then this last one is most the way. Now, had we used an auto siphon, it would probably be much closer to the bottom. Maybe even half to 3/4 of the bottle would have been left behind. Now, unfortunately, we're still in the temporary studio, so Phil will have to do the corking off camera. But we'll talk about the various corks he's using. This first one's a normal cork, which is a synthetic cork, and has tons of advantages. But the next one we're going to use is what's called a premium quality cork, because they're really good at names. At least premium makes sense for it being probably the best quality all-natural cork you'll be able to get your hands on without spending an arm and a leg. Those are called floor corks, and they go for about $1 a piece, and are recommended for people that are going to do more professional work in wine. But just like most natural corks, these premium quality ones will need to be stored upright for 3 days before being stored horizontally for the rest of their lives before they're drunk. First, the cork needs time to completely expand before being set sideways to prevent leaks, and then you need to keep the cork moist so that it doesn't dry out. Same for these first quality corks. Natural cork, but it's glued together. It's not one solid punch through the cork. But neither was the last one. That one only had discs on both ends that are solid cork, but the center are aggregate. And that's mostly fine, except for the fact that that means that these corks, the first quality specifically, won't last longer than 3 years. In fact, the manufacturer says 1.5 years. 3 years for the premium qualities. But at 10 cents a piece, if all you're making is fruit wines you're going to drink right away, what's the harm? Whereas the normal corks can do over 10 years. Plus, another cool advantage is they don't have to be stored on their side or stood up for 3 days first. So whatever you want to do with them, they're good to go. In fact, that's why we use them as our primary cork, because we give the gift of wine quite a bit. So we don't want the person we give it to have to know anything about wine, because they probably don't. But enough of a cork tangent. Let's get back to this blackberry Moscato. And we got one that we're not going to cork, because what's the point of corking a half bottle? And what's the best way to describe this wine? An anti-wine cooler. Because yeah, it's got a lot more sugar to it and a lot more alcohol. So it's like a dessert wine that's still very fruity. It's got a very robust but not overpowering blackberry flavor to it. I dare say you put this on a little bit of French oak and you got my favorite wine right here. We will be making this again. Dare I say even in a 6-gallon batch? And if you don't want to miss when that happens, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to know more about winemaking, check out the videos on the left. And if you want to know more about the fancier wine kits that WinExpert makes, check out this video on the right. Toodles!